So I have the great pleasure of welcoming you yesterday evening and carrying you through the night to this morning where you're all looking bright and vibrant, so welcome back. So this morning, just a couple quick things here. First of all, welcome back to our beautiful Saturday morning. I'd like to recognize again that we are meeting today on Treaty 6 and the homeland of the Métis here at the University of Saskatchewan. I'd also like this opportunity to take the time to thank our Osprey sponsors that have helped make this conference a success. The Aboriginal Education Research Centre, Project Learning Tree Canada, Royal Roads University. So if we can give them a round of applause. I'm not going to be up here too much because we have two wonderful speakers today. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome up Jebanessa Chipola, who's a graduate PhD student here at the university in education.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Adams, and thanks, EECOM, for giving me this opportunity today to introduce our keynote speakers. As you can see, Idle No More, it's on our screen. Let me tell you what is Idle No More. I'm pretty sure everybody knows what is Idle No More, but again, it is my responsibility today to introduce. Idle No More has quickly become one of the largest Indigenous mass movements in Canadian history, sparking hundreds of teach-ins, rallies, and protests across Turtle Island and beyond. What began as a series of teach-ins throughout Saskatchewan to protest impending parliamentary bills that will erode Indigenous sovereignty and environmental protections has now changed the social and political geography of Canada. Now I would like to invite our keynote speakers, Sylvia McAdam and Sheelah McLean. I'm requesting you to come on stage. Sylvia is from the Treaty 6 lands in what is now Canada. She is a direct descendant of Treaty and original peoples of these lands. Sylvia is from the Nihoyo Nation. She has her Juris Doctorate from the University of Saskatchewan and a bachelor's degree in human justice from the University of Regina. Sylvia is co-founder of a global grassroots Indigenous-led movement called Idle No More. Sylvia is also co-founder of the One House, Many Nations campaign, which designs off-the-grid, sustainable tiny homes to address and raise awareness about the epidemic, unacceptable proportions of homelessness in a wealthy state as Canada, especially amongst Indigenous and original peoples. I would like to offer tobacco to Sylvia first. Now it's my honor to introduce Sheelah McLean. Sheelah McLean has a PhD in anti-racist education from the University of Saskatchewan. She has worked as a high school teacher and taught graduate and undergraduate courses in the College of Education for over 15 years. Sheelah is also an organizer with the Idle No More network. As an educator, scholar, and community organizer, Sheelah's work has focused on research projects and actions that focus on the legacy of oppression experienced by Indigenous peoples within a white settler society. Sheelah has received many honors for her work in social justice, including the University of Saskatchewan's Alumni of Influence Award in 2013, the Council of Canadians Activist of the Year Award 2014, and the Carol Geller Human Rights Award 2015. Let's welcome our keynote speakers, Sheelah, McLean, and Sylvia.
So I'm going first. So Sheelah and I have been mistaken numerous times because we look so much alike. I've been called Sylvia McLean. So today I wanted to talk about how Idle No More began for me, and each one of us have our stories. There's so many powerful stories connected to Idle No More, but I live about 2.5 hours north of Saskatoon in the Treaty 6 lands, unceded, unsurrendered, unfinished treaty business. I'm going to repeat that, unfinished treaty business that Canada continues to violate. These lands are supposed to be protected. They're protected by Treaty 6. But because the colonial state called Canada continues to violate those, we continue as Indigenous people, and this is a generational resistance. I'm carrying it on from my father, my grandfather, and his father, and I don't want to pass it on to my children or my grandchildren, but it's seeming to be that way. The information today that I'm going to provide to you will not be available to you in any colonial education system. You will hear it here from me because I am directly connected to the lands that you benefit from. These are stolen lands. So my family and I, we do a walk every year, and we do a deforestation walk of the lands that I'm talking about here today. They're the Boreal forest, and we put up signage. I don't know who it is, I haven't caught them yet, but they keep taking my signage down. No logging, no trespassing, idle no more, stop the logging, all different kind of signage. How many of you have heard of the Amazon rainforest? We should rightfully all be outraged about what's happening over there. It's terrible. But all of you need to know that Canada exceeds the Amazon rainforest in terms of the deforestation. Did you know that? Yeah. Canada exceeds the deforestation of the Boreal forest, exceeds the Amazon. At the rate, and I'm not talking about 100 miles. I'm not talking about 200 miles. This is hundreds and hundreds of miles of Boreal forest that is clear cut. The method in which the logging companies use to clear cut the land has been condemned by the United Nations, and yet they continue to use it because there is no consequences for their actions. No consequences at all. That's my dad. We told my dad, don't go there. Don't go there, Dad. My dad doesn't really speak any English. He doesn't speak any English because he was one of the very, very few Indigenous children that were hidden away when the Indian agent and the priest came for the children. And that's the forest that he was hidden away that once stood so powerfully to hide him. It's been clear cut. The provincial government, known as the Department of Natural Resources at the time, from 1990 to approximately 1998, went around burning down Indigenous shelters. And we were one of the families where our shelters were burnt down. And that shelter once stood there amongst the powerful Boreal forest, and even that's gone. And you're not going to find that in any of your history books. So my nephew and I, my family, we went and stood our ground. It's more like a symbolic resistance than anything. It's a symbolic blockade because there's so many roads that the colonizer can access our lands. And so we stood our ground, my nephew and I. We went and lived out there, and we left that one day. We left for about 4 hours, and I'm positive that we're being watched over there, because when we came back, we drove up the road, and our signage was shot up. And if you know anything about weaponry, a .22 gun is not lethal. It will not kill a human unless you directly aim for their head, but it won't kill a human. Those bullet holes on that signage is from a rifle, and a rifle is lethal. So my nephew and I, we drove back to our shelter, and we started building a fire. And both of us just went silent. We didn't even talk. We started building the fire, and I started cooking, and it was about 8:30, and we sat around our fire. We didn't talk. And then he turns to me, and my nephew is 12 years old at the time. His name is Gisik. And he says to me, "Auntie, you know that was a death threat." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I'm scared. I want to go home." And home to him is on the reservation that we're registered as Indians in the apartheid system that Canada continues to perpetuate. And yet we're all outraged about the apartheid system in Africa, and yet we're complacent. A lot of Canadians are complacent in the apartheid that continues to exist here in Canada. So we went back there, and the next morning he phones me up, and he goes, "Auntie." And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "We have to go back." So we went back and we stayed. But the good news is we did save some of the forest. We did. Someday that young man, and that's because, it was because of powerful grassroots people, our allies. And Sheelah's been out there numerous times, and we walked it and protected, and it's because of those actions. And I'm so grateful for the people that did come out, that we did save some of the forest, and it still stands today. And I'll be there this summer to continue protecting it. And as a result of it, we created One House, Many Nations, because we wanted to rebuild the shelter that the government, the province had burnt down. And we were taken to court. We were taken to court because we refused to get a permit from the colonial state, because we have always existed on those lands before any colonizers came here, but they wanted us to get a permit from them to get permission to build the shelter that they had burnt down. And we said, "No, that don't make no sense. We've always existed here." So they said we're in violation of their law, and they took us to court. But we won. Another small victory. But hold on. They have 60 days to appeal. So we'll see where that takes us. That'll take us to about May 21st. And then we'll feel a bit of victory once we know that they're not going to appeal. Oh, that's yours. And the thing that I really like about One House, Many Nations is that wood stove that can generate electricity. It can generate electricity. And if you look at the shelters that we build, we try to build shelters that live with the land. And the man that we gave this shelter to had been homeless for 16 years. And if you know anything about shelter is totally connected to mental health. It's totally connected to mental health. So once the appeal passes, we're going to rebuild, my dad, a shelter on the land that once protected him from the Indian agent and the priests. And because my father and my mother were one of the hidden children, today I am still able to speak my language. So that's the resistance. Just being born indigenous is a resistance, a political statement that we still exist today. And every day it seems like I have to fight for my right to exist. To exist. And yet it's supposed to be protected by Treaty 6. And the violence that the state continues to perpetuate, we see it in the laws that they pass, like the arming and the militarization of the conservation officers. They're going to be carrying AR-15s now. Imagine that. Why are we not outraged? Why are not Canadians outraged about that? Because the conservation officers are going to be interacting with mainly my people who are out on the land. Think about what it is that keeps Canadians silent in the face of Indigenous violence. And Sheelah's going to talk about that. And the other thing that just passed in Saskatchewan is a law that is similar to Stand Your Ground that came from the US. So we need to ask, all of you need to ask yourselves, why is there such a silence and a complacency when these laws come from that place of violence against Indigenous peoples? So I'm going to hand this over to Sheelah, and it's her turn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sylvia, and I've had the honor and the privilege of working with Sylvia for the last 7 years. Yeah, very closely in the Idle No More movement. And I'm a third-generation white settler, and I was born and raised here on Treaty 6 territory. I'm first and foremost a teacher and was a high school teacher for 25 years, but I also went up to do a master's in education because the students that I taught, and predominantly the Indigenous students and students of color I taught, talked about experiences they had in the schools and in the community that my limited explanations were inadequate for. They talked about their experiences of racism and racial violence, and it was one of the reasons that I went up to the College of Education and took a master's degree in anti-racist education. And really, it was the Idle No More movement, in part, that spurred me on to also do a PhD, because I think public education is the most important thing that we can focus on right now. And the Idle No More movement, while it's a wave of many waves of Indigenous resistance on this continent, one of the two tools that we used was public education and also nonviolent direct action. So putting some pressure on these institutions, on these corporations, to stop the violence towards Indigenous people. We are going to talk about solutions at the end and hopefully have time for comments and questions. But I would like to think about public education for a minute and what allyship means, given the context that Sylvia has laid out for us. So Sylvia asked a question, why aren't more Canadians outraged? We know that there were many non-Indigenous people, white settlers and people of color, that joined the Idle No More movement and that worked in solidarity with Indigenous people against the extractive industries, against the government policies. In particular, the two government policies we worked against was Bill C-38 and Bill C-45. And they were omnibus bills, and the purpose of them was to remove the rights of Indigenous people so that extractive industries could do as they please. So I want you to think about that. And I want you to also think about the fact that, we worked night and day as volunteers in the movement to educate the Canadian public on these issues. And why do we need to educate the Canadian public on these issues when we have public education systems? What's missing from our public education systems? So when we ask questions like, why aren't more Canadians outraged about climate change, about the crisis that we're facing, about the violence that Indigenous communities face, about racialized injustice when it comes to environmental issues, and how those play out, we know that this isn't just a Native thing, as this sign says. I'm Canadian and I am angry, and we need more of these signs. We need more of this work, and it can only happen as we educate people. And as we continue to educate the public. Now, we were lucky as a movement, we were able to use social media. And I want to note to you that mainstream media does not always tell the full story. It's limited. I have friends that are journalists that try to cover particular stories during the Idle No More movement, for instance. And it would be their editors or it would be the bosses in Toronto that would nix those stories. No, it's a good story, but we're not going to cover that. So mainstream media and public education is the two places that we get most of our information. Those are the two places that shape how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves, and how we think about what's happening to the environment. And I would argue that most of the research that I've done is looking at white settler identity and how it maintains these systems, these problematic systems of violence. And so we have, particularly in Canada, the myth of Canadian state benevolence. In other words, when I ask my students, both high school and university, to write just a 2 or 3 page paper telling me, what is the Canadian identity? This is what I receive. Canada is democratic, multicultural country, free from racism and violence. Canadian citizens are caring, tolerant people that have a global reputation for peacekeeping. Now, how many of you recognize this discourse or grew up with it? All of us. And when I do talks across Canada, overwhelmingly people say, I recognize this, I grew up with this. And what we have to know is this isn't just our state identity as a nation state, this is our identity as Canadian citizens as well. We are multicultural and tolerant. We are democratic. And we are innocent of violence. And yet, given that narrative, how do you explain what Sylvia just laid out for us? How are we complicit in the violence through our silence, or through our inaction, or through our lack of anger, or by buying into these corporate systems, or by voting for particular parties to represent us in government, or even thinking that the government is the answer to these problems that we're talking about and facing today? So one thing I want to ask today, and it's a larger question that we can continue to think about, is how do our mass media, our public education systems, our libraries, our textbooks, our curriculum, and other resources uphold this myth? Because I see it everywhere. Like, we're surrounded by the myth of Canadian benevolence, and yet that is not the experiences of Indigenous people who face genocide in this country. And so I find it interesting that, the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg refuses to use the word genocide. And that's one small example of how Canadians are unwilling to look at the violence in this country and how it's perpetuated towards Indigenous people, the erasure of these conversations, and why it's so important for us as Canadians to support Indigenous people right now. That's how climate change is going to change. It has to be by following and supporting the rights of Indigenous people. And I'm gonna talk about that a little bit. I think when we talk about climate change and climate discourse, I wrote a paper called The Whiteness of Green, Racialization and Environmental Education. And I wanna just give you a caution about the discourse of climate change. As this tweet says, you're about 500 years, 7 colonized continents, and countless atrocities too late for the whole "we are all one race" stuff. The discourse of climate change can start to, position us all as facing the same issues. And I think what we have to do is even more now realize that while we all are impacted, absolutely, in the end, the truth is Indigenous people have been impacted for over 500 years, while others were complacent and benefited. And you can see who dominates the institutions in this country. They're white settler people. That's who dominates these institutions, who have benefited from extractive industry, who have benefited from theft. We have to have those conversations. And we have to say, what can we do as settlers, as people who have benefited from this system, to ally with Indigenous people and work against it? That our conversations about climate change cannot forget not just who's been most impacted, but also who's benefited. And that we have to be able to intervene in that. That white supremacy, that white settler identity is the main problem. Because white settlers, when they came here, believed, first of all, that this was their land, the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius and the idea of empty land, the dehumanization and racist idea that this land was empty continues today. So there's one problem, and the other problem is that resources just could be taken, right, as quickly as possible and as much as possible. So part of our identity as white settlers is consumption. Consumption of land, consumption of resources. And you can see how that plays out in the industries, right? The makeup industry, the clothing industry, the housing industry. Consume, consume, consume as part of white settler identity. And those, again, are the bodies that really dominate those institutions. So that's one thing I think we really need to keep in mind. Another is that First Nations people are on, the front of this struggle. It's going to be Indigenous people and the decisions of Canadians that stand alongside them that will determine the fate of the planet. And that's a quote by Martin Lukacs. He is part of Defenders of the Land, someone that worked closely with Sylvia and I, and someone who understands, like many of us who are white settlers, that it's by standing behind Indigenous people who have the right to protect their land and resources, the inherent right. They are the only ones that can stop the government and corporations, and the government know it. And that's why they're rushing through these policies, pushing through these policies to try to mitigate Indigenous inherent rights. It's why Indigenous people, when they protect their land, face the most violence. In fact, it's why racism continues. The only purpose of racism is to justify inequality. That's the only purpose of it. And so the racism continues to justify the inequitable practices that we see. And one thing we'll talk about with, for instance, One House, Many Nations, is we see how the logging and extractive industries take from the reserves and Indigenous lands, and that they never go back. Where do they go? They don't go back to Indigenous communities. So we see how poverty in Indigenous community is enacted through these policies, these racist policies. So I'd like to suggest that for me, what I've learned, and it's taken me a long time to learn this, is that the only way to really face the climate crisis and climate change is to defend the land. And in order to defend the land, we have to defend land defenders. We have to defend Indigenous people by pushing our government, by supporting Indigenous inherent rights, by facing racism, by facing racial violence, and by really talking about genocide. It's discomforting. It can be upsetting for our students. And I've taught high school students an anti-racist course that was really focused on social and environmental justice. And sometimes they left my class crying. And sometimes they felt overwhelmed. But I feel like, shouldn't we be? Shouldn't we be? Our schools play a part in normalizing what's happening right now in our environment and what's happening right now to Indigenous people. We play a part in being complacent in it, and as teachers, I think our students should be upset, when we talk about these issues. That's our job. That's our job, to teach them the truth so that they can do something about it. And that's why Sylvia and I called this Idle No More, the Next Generation, because we think about the youth all the time, how to educate, how to get them involved, how to teach them that it doesn't have to be this way. None of this is inevitable. This is human decisions every day. Human thoughts, human ideas, human decisions. And so I would say that for Idle No More, being an ally means you get involved in public education and nonviolent direct action. You get involved in speaking out and acting out against these institutions, education, justice, child welfare, government, these institutions that continue to commit these violences on Indigenous people. And it means putting our bodies in front of that violence, that's part of being an ally. And it's understanding how things like racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism are all connected to these colonial violences towards Indigenous people. That's a longer conversation that we don't have time for today, but there's so many amazing scholars that have written about this, understanding how these inequities play out in a colonial context. And I want to say a caution about allyship as well, though, because sometimes people that start to understand, and this is me as well, this is a constant struggle. We start to think about allyship with Indigenous people, and there can be problems with that as well. There's tensions. When you're part of the dominant group that benefit, how do you ally with Indigenous people that are facing these violences? So often, the most common way is to reinforce white superiority through white saviorism or white heroism, right? We're going to help those people. We're innocent of this violence, but these big corporations are the problem. You know, positioning ourselves somehow outside of these systems as though we don't benefit from them every day. So really important to position ourselves within them, to understand our own family history and who we are, and to say, I'm not there to help. I'm there to work in solidarity behind and beside Indigenous people as they fight these systems. White saviorism is very paternalistic. It's this idea of ownership. I keep hearing our First Nations, you know, our Indigenous people. That's a state narrative, that the state believes they own Indigenous people. And that goes back to terra nullius, and Indigenous people were just part of the flora and the fauna. So we own the land, we own the resources, and we own Indigenous people. When you see the word our First Nations or our Indigenous people, you speak out about that. People need to stop acting like there's an ownership, there's a paternalism, you know, and that's part of the problem with white saviorism. Overly nice, as if niceness is the main problem, right? Rather than the inequities that are happening every day. Kind of a tokenism where we invite Indigenous people to be one small part of a conference or one small part of our NGO or one small part of our environmental group, thinking that we've, you know, got that figured out, instead of building deep relationships where we can work together to strategize and think about how to change things. And of course, cultural appropriation. Because of our discomfort when we learn that we are on stolen land, that the Canadian state is a myth and a fallacy, we often start to sort of appropriate indigeneity. It gives us comfort. It makes us feel like that's a place where we can learn. And I want to caution you that that's not the answer that we need right now. It's taking on these systems of white supremacy. And that's a harder job. It's more discomforting, but it's the thing that's going to make change. So allyship, I would say, is open to learning, takes responsibility for the racism and inequities that we see in our communities. They understand justice and equality and what that might look like in their communities. They understand who they are and where they came from and work in solidarity with Indigenous people to make real change. So I would argue that what we need to do is unsettle these systems in any way we can, to continue to work through education and nonviolent direct action to change what's happening, for instance, on Sylvia's land. And as she said, this is not just happening in one place, it's happening across Canada right now. And what we see in the last, I'd say, 15 years is a shift towards a more conservative, government, and also a shift towards a speeding up of these extractive industries. They have sped them up. And many chiefs that we've worked with have talked about the fact that, for instance, in the tar sands, in the oil sands, oil that they were going to take out over 25 years, suddenly taken over 5. And what that does. So it's about feeding investors, right, who are Canadian public, who are white settlers, majority, feeding investors, feeding these corporate executives. How do we challenge that? How do we stop that? How do we unsettle these systems? How do we unsettle our school systems that continue to commit violence by not talking about these issues ever, by pretending to be neutral and objective? That's what I grew up on, this new idea that education needs to be neutral and objective. And the truth is we're not. We maintain complicity, we maintain white settler superiority by saying nothing and doing nothing. So unsettling the state, unsettling the settler state, I think is the key to climate change. And is the key to changing these systems. And I'm just going to invite Sylvia over to talk about one big project that we've both been involved in, because as Idle No More activists, at the beginning in particular, people kept asking us, okay, well, you guys are, speaking out against all these systems, for instance, big oil, but what's the solution? And so we thought, well, I guess part of the protest has to be, what are the solutions? And so that's what we want to talk about now to end. And then we'll open up for questions and comments.
So One House, Many Nations at Opaskwayak Cree Nation, that's OCN right there at the end. It's Opaskwayak Cree Nation with Alex Wilson, and she did a workshop on this. So for those of you that attended, you got more details on it, but this house is can sit like, when back in the day when the Indian agent and the land was being surveyed, they gave the crappiest land to Indigenous peoples, even though it was our land. Opaskwayak ended up with mainly muskeg. Their land is mainly muskeg. So in one of the workshops, we started working with a white guy named Jacob Mans. He was a Harvard graduate, very intelligent man. And then we told him our ideas about how we wanted to work with the land, with the community of OCN. And then we came up with this idea how shelter could sit on the muskeg and move with the muskeg without getting black mold. And then we came up with this design. It's called cross-laminated timber. It will have the lifespan of a tree. Isn't that beautiful? The lifespan of a tree. So it can go to about 90 years, and it will never have black mold. And that's such an issue in Indigenous communities. There's this black mold issue. And so this one will never have black mold. And we're having a workshop in OCN, and I'm going there tomorrow, and it'll be there for this week. And we're designing another shelter called the Muskrat Hut. And it's more a communal shelter, but this shelter was given to another homeless man. And he's pretty happy in there. But the one thing also that we did learn, we didn't think of at the time, the first build that we did, we delivered it to the gentleman, and he could easily be the face of so many thousands of people that we know across these lands, homeless, addictions. And the thing about this gentleman was he quit on his own. And so when the shelter was delivered to him, there was one thing we didn't think of. What he would go to his little shelter and then go back to the shelter that he was living in. And it was like a shanty, like a chicken coop that he was living in before. It was like it was ready to fall apart. Anyway, and then he would go back to the mini home and then go back to the shelter. It was like, and then we're like wondering what the heck is going on. And then we figured out Alex has a psychology degree, a minor in psychology, and she figured out that when you dehumanize a person for so long, they begin to feel unworthy. They begin to feel as if they are undeserving of such a beautiful thing. But eventually, he did accept it, and he fully moved in. Somewhere, he found that place where he felt worthy, which was incredible. So he moved in, and last night when I went to visit him, he was painting his house and putting a little extension to it. But that was one thing that we didn't take into consideration, was the emotional part of the human beings when you're working with them, and the oppression and the dehumanization that comes with it.
You know, one of the things that Alex Wilson, Dr. Alex Wilson is doing, and she was one of the supervisors for my PhD, is building a sustainable community. So instead of mini homes, what we're doing is, as you can see, larger housing units, and the community is a huge part of like creating these units. So they get to decide what they look like. The materials all come from the community. It's a really amazing project, and I invite you to look further into it through social media. So if you're on Facebook, or you can absolutely Google One House, Many Nations, and you can find many, many articles, because actually the media has been pretty good about covering it. But we're gonna end with this. This is the big project. Now, we're still involved in many Idle No More projects and many campaigns, but I think, you know, in terms of time, and just in the interest of time, we'll stop with this last example of the things that Idle No More continues to do. The most frustrating thing for us is the media. We'll talk about Idle No More as though it was only a year long. And I mean, that was the public expression of it. Like, we were on the, you know, in the malls and on the Parliament steps. But there's more work to do than just public expressions of protest. There's other work to do as well, and this is the kind of work that Idle No More is involved in right now, is thinking about what are the alternatives. But we want to take maybe one or two questions, and then we'll move it over to housekeeping. So are there any comments or questions for us? And yes?
Just on your point of being unbiased in the school system, I'm a teacher in Regina, and we took a bunch of students to the climate march and strike that were started by Greta Thunberg, so they're kind of happening around the country. But last Friday, we got permission to take a class excursion, and then like 6 teachers took classes, and we had a couple of parents who complained about it and said we're brainwashing kids. And I had one parent who emailed me and said, you know, activism doesn't have a place in educational institutions, like it should just be presenting alternative viewpoints. I really didn't know how to answer that question, because I was like, I get it, but I had one colleague who, just one parent commented about how, you know, he was addressing this with his class, and now he is being supervised, and all his stuff that he's teaching is being looked over by administration, and it's just, I mean, we're not just getting the support we need from administration to do these kind of things, and it's very frustrating, and so we're not going to continue with this.
Yeah.
But it's just, how do we handle that? How do we address these points from parents that say getting involved in activism? I mean, it goes to your point that we're supposed to be balanced. I mean, my principal even told me that, like, we need to be balanced, and I was like,
But we're not balanced, right? No, we're not. So I guess I could just give a couple of points. It's a longer conversation, as you know. But Karen and I were just talking this morning about the fact that I had a high school course called Applied Global Citizenship, where we went out to protest, where we really dug into social and environmental justice issues, where we really talked about white identity. And that program lasted a few years and then was closed down as well. Especially as we got involved in the Idle No More movement. That was the big fear, right, is Indigenous rights to the state, to the colonial state. So I would say that for teachers, just keep doing the wonderful work you're doing, keep pushing, do what you can, and don't stop, and create a network if you can, and do some public education outside of your school. If they won't let you inside, they can't do anything about what you do at night and on weekends. Do as much as you can to educate the community and network, and get people that aren't teachers and in the system to start to push the system. So what institutions hate the most is bad press. I'm gonna give you a hint. And schools especially. So you don't do it, right? Because your job is at stake, but you have friends and family members that might be willing to publicly talk about the fact that they're closing those down, that they're silencing these issues, and why are they doing that? Use research. Go to the school board and show the school board the research, because there's so much of it. You know, there's all sorts of things we can do, but you're gonna have to commit the time and energy to keep fighting no matter what. It's just that simple. Don't let them shut you down. Just keep doing it.
What would you say to this parent that says activism has no place in schools?
Well, and neither does silence. So, I would tell them, but we're not having these conversations at all in schools. So this ridiculous idea that there are two sides or something like that, like the last thing I said to a teacher that said that to me was, do you teach both sides of the Holocaust? As though they're equally valid? Teachers don't. So we shouldn't be doing that here either. And I think pointing that out is really important. And having good research, having solid, examples is really important. Pushing school board and pushing admin. But this space is particularly interesting. Like, this is a space where there was the Riel resistance that Big Bear and Powmaker were part of. We've had the Idle No More resistance. The prairies were an important space to the Canadian government for building the nation. And we have a high number of Indigenous people here, and it's why they clamp down on this work. It is. It's why, with Colton Bushey's murder, there wasn't more outrage from Canadian settlers. The combination of racism and that this space is so important in maintaining the colonial state, right? So, next question? I'll let you answer.
I grew up in BC on the traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, and I grew up in a community where the Indigenous populations were very visible. I currently work in the West Kootenays, where on the traditional territory of the Snayaks. Now, the Snayaks was declared extinct by the federal government, and we have virtually no visible Indigenous people in our communities. And I feel like when I'm trying to, it's like the opposite of what you guys have here, and it's difficult for my students to conceptualize anything around Indigenous communities because they don't see it in their communities. We're predominantly white, and I don't know how to offer them any type of experiential learning because of this.
She's like, I don't know what to do with white people. That's yours, Sheelah. And it is. It's ours to own. What do we do with white people? I don't know all the answers to that, but I do know that, in terms of experiential, one of the reasons I wrote The Whiteness of Green is because students were coming in from land-based programs in elementary school and high school here in Saskatoon, and they had no idea about anything about Indigenous people or racism or colonialism, and I thought, how can they be taking these amazing progressive programs where they learned so much and it was experiential and not learning about whose land we're on or how we got it? It was bizarre to me. I made assumptions about these programs that they were really progressive. And I decided to look into it and study it, and that's when I wrote The Whiteness of Green. Most of my writing and my questions come from experiences I've had here in Saskatoon or here in Saskatchewan. And I think you could read that paper and then you could think about, when we go out to do experiential learning, what's missing? So I teach problematic textbooks, I teach problematic films, but we talk about what's problematic about it. What's missing? What needs to be there? You could invite speakers in. You could bring film. You could bring scholarship. You could bring books from Indigenous people who have been doing this work for a really long time. That's what I do. I become a facilitator to the Indigenous knowledge that I bring into my classroom. Also, you could get them on social media to see what's Idle No More doing. What was that movement? Have them dig into the research of the 500 years of resistance of Indigenous peoples and what's happening on those territories, and then locate it at home. I think there's so many ways for us to do this, even if we don't have access to the resources that we need. So those are just some ideas, but I'd be happy to, talk to you about more, because I think there's more that we can do to invite people into our communities to talk about these issues, so we're not the only one speaking to them.
And my people can be just as problematic because we've been colonized for so long. We begin to believe the colonizers' lies. I've had my own people attack me when I start talking about white supremacy and racism, and they start saying we're all one race. So the colonization has done really brutal work And for those of you who have unpacked and analyzed your position in these systems, will recognize the colonization of my people better than they themselves. And so colonization sucks. It really does. And it affects everyone. Everyone. These systems are not working, not even for the white people. They're not working. So Kinanas no mina kasoim guauxi mantumno kamil giwig itigawi sigiwi paig. May the Creator bless your journeys home, and thank you for being here.